What if tomorrow the power went out? For good. No phone, no heat, no stores, no help. That's the world pioneers faced every single day. They crossed thousands of miles of raw, unforgiving land with nothing but a wagon, a few tools, and the knowledge they carried in their head. They didn't just survive, they endured. They made fire without matches, purified filthy water, built tools from nothing, navigated with the sun, the stars, and instinct. They made soap from ashes, candles from tallow, and meals from scraps most of us wouldn't touch today. These were the forgotten survival skills of the pioneer-era skills born from hardship, passed down through grit, and now nearly lost. In this video, we're going to step into their world and uncover the off-grid bushcraft wisdom that still works and might one day save your life. Fire without matches. Fire wasn't a luxury, it was a life. Without fire, there was no warmth, no hot food, no clean water, no safety. A cold night on the trail without it could mean hypothermia or wolves circling in the dark. And while it's easy to think matches made things simple, the truth is most early pioneers didn't have them, or if they did, they didn't trust them. Matches were expensive, unreliable, and nearly useless when wet. One wrong step, one splash in a stream, and they were gone. So they learned to make fire the old-fashioned way. And for many, that meant flint and steel. You've seen it in movies, the sharp crack of steel against stone, the sudden flash. But here's how it really worked out on the trail. A carbon steel striker was hit against a piece of flint rock, shaving off tiny bits of hot metal, those sparks. But a spark alone wasn't enough. You needed something that could catch that spark and hold it. Char cloth. Char cloth was one of the most ingenious tools a pioneer could carry. It was just 100% cotton, like a strip from an old shirt or bandana, cut into squares and placed in a small tin with a single pinhole. That tin was then placed in a fire. As the cotton heated inside, it blackened, smoked, and slowly turned into a fragile, carbon-rich fabric. It didn't burst into flames. It smoldered. And that slow ember is exactly what you needed. When a spark hit the char cloth just right, it began to glow like the tip of a lit cigarette. That glowing ember was gold. Carefully, they'd move it into a nest of dry tinder things like dry grass, cedar bark, or shredded cottonwood. Then came the part that looked like magic. A few gentle breaths. The nest began to smoke. Then suddenly, almost silently, a flame flickered to life. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a morning routine, a survival act. Many pioneers carried a tinder box at all times, filled with flint, steel, char cloth, and tinder, ready for the moment they needed it. But what if you had no flint and no steel? Then came one of the oldest, most challenging methods of fire making in human history, the bow drill. Now, if you didn't have flint and steel, or if they were lost crossing a river or buried in a sudden snowstorm, you still had one last hope: the bow drill. This tool is older than written history, used by Native American tribes long before settlers ever arrived. But the pioneers adopted it when there was no other choice. And though it looks simple, just a few sticks and a string, in the right hands, it became fire itself. Here's how it worked. You'd start with a dry spindle, a straight stick, usually cedar or cottonwood. The end was carved to a blunt point. That spindle would rest on a flat piece of wood called a hearthboard. To make it spin, you'd build a bow, a bent branch with a leather thong or cord tied across it. The spindle sat in a loop of the bowstring, and on top, you'd press down with a rock or carved hand-hold bone, wood, anything that fit your palm. Then came the real challenge: moving the bow back and forth steadily, spinning the spindle fast enough to build heat. Smoke would rise. A small black coal would form in a notch at the base of the hearth. That tiny ember was precious. You'd tip it into a bundle of dry grass, shredded bark, or old rope fibers, and blow gently. Smoke, glow, and then, if you were lucky, a flicker of flame. It could take minutes or hours. Your arms shook, your shirt soaked with sweat. But when that ember caught and fire came to life, you felt like you had summoned the sun itself. For pioneers stuck without supplies, stranded in snow, soaked from river crossings, this was the difference between life and death, and it wasn't guaranteed. Trail diaries tell of men who tried for hours with cold fingers and damp kindling, only to fail. One entry from 1851 near South Pass, Wyoming reads, "Our matches were spoiled crossing the Sweetwater. John tried the bow for nearly an hour, but failed. We huddled for warmth and prayed the snow would lift by morning." That's the truth of frontier firemaking. It wasn't romantic, it was hard, and only the stubborn survived. If you think lighting a fire without matches was hard, try staying clean on the trail. Out in the wild, soap wasn't something you bought. You made it, from scratch, with ashes and animal fat. No stores, no labels, no pleasant scent, just necessity. And while it wasn't exactly lavender-scented, it worked. So how did the pioneers make soap? It all started with lye. Lye is a caustic substance created when water runs through hardwood ashes, especially from oak, hickory, or maple. After cooking a meal or warming the camp, families would scoop up the cold ashes from the fire and dump them into a wooden barrel or hollowed-out log. Then they'd slowly pour rainwater or snow melt over the top. The water would seep through the ashes, leaching out a chemical reaction that collected at the bottom. A dark, brown, slightly oily liquid, lye water. But how did they know it was strong enough? They'd test it. If the liquid stung when touched, or if it turned a dropped feather brittle and curled, it was ready. That was your base. Now comes the next ingredient, fat. Whether it was pig tallow, beef sweet, or even bear grease, fat was gold on the trail. It fueled lamps, cooked food, softened leather, and made soap. To make it usable, they melted it down slowly in a pot over the fire, then stirred it into the hot lye water. Carefully. Too fast and it would separate. Too cold and it wouldn't blend. So they stirred, boiled, stirred again. Hours of effort, smoke in their eyes and arms aching. Eventually, if the mixture was just right, something remarkable happened. It thickened, hardened. It is saponified. In other words, it turned into actual soap. They'd pour this paste into wooden molds or shallow pans and leave it to cool. After a few days, they'd slice it into rough blocks, sometimes square, sometimes lumpy, but usable. This soap was powerful, sometimes harsh, but it cleaned clothes, dishes, floors, hands, and even wounds. Some women added mint, pine, or lard to soften the texture. Others used it as is, grateful for anything to scrape away days of sweat and trail dust. But soap wasn't the only necessity they had to create by hand. Candles were another essential tool, and another chore that took time, resources, and patience. Because when night fell out there, it fell hard. No distant porch lights, no glowing screens, just endless darkness. And whatever light you could make with your own hands. Most pioneer candles were made from tallow, the same rendered animal fat used for soap. First, you'd melt the fat slowly over a fire until it turned liquid and clear. Then you'd dip a cotton string in, pull it out, let it cool, then dip again, dry, over and over, dozens of times. Each layer of fat built up around the string, forming a lumpy but usable candle. If you had the tools, you might pour the tallow into molds with a centered wick. But dipping was easier and didn't require anything fancy, just a steady hand and patience. The finished product, smoky, greasy, and definitely not fragrant. But when lit, it gave off a warm, flickering light. And in the wilderness, that was priceless. If you were lucky enough to live near a beekeeper, or brought wax from back east, you might have a beeswax candle. Those burned longer and cleaner, but they were rare. Most folks used what they had. Did you know? In the 1830s, A pound of candles could cost more than a day's wages. That's why many families rationed their light, saving candles for only the most important moments, reading scripture, tending wounds, or checking on children during long, cold nights. And sometimes, light wasn't an option at all. Here's a chilling line from a pioneer's diary near Fort Laramie. "Tonight the wind blows cruelly through the canvas. We've no tallow left. The dark feels close to death." That was reality. There were no shortcuts on the frontier. Every basic need, warmth, light, cleanliness, had to be made, earned, or done without. And yet, they kept going. When you're traveling across thousands of miles of untamed wilderness, things break, constantly. Wagon wheels snap, axles splinter, harnesses fray, shovels bend, knives dull. And when they do, there's no repair shop waiting around the next bend, no replacements, no shipping delays, because there's no shipping at all. Out on the frontier, you were your own blacksmith, carpenter, and mechanic. If something broke, you fixed it, or you did without. Improvisation wasn't just a useful trait, it was a survival skill. Let's start with wagons. These weren't rugged tanks. They were wooden skeletons held together by iron bolts, leather straps, and hope. And they took a beating. Rough trails, river crossings, rocks, sand, snow. A cracked wheel rim could strand an entire family. So pioneers carried tools and the knowledge to use them. Axes, augers, wooden pegs, rawhide, rope. If an axle cracked, they'd fell a nearby tree and shape a rough replacement on the spot. Sometimes they carved wooden pins to replace missing nails or used strips of wet rawhide to lash pieces together. As the hide dried, it shrunk and tightened like glue. Leather was a miracle material on the trail. Straps broke constantly on harnesses, backpacks, even shoes. So families saved every scrap they could. Old belts, saddle pieces, worn-out boots. They'd cut them into usable strips and rework them into bindings. It wasn't pretty, but it held. Broken cooking gear? They made do. Some repaired iron pots with wire or hammered tin patches. Others tied split handles with green wood, which tightened as it dried. Knives were sharpened on stones, wagon rims, even bricks. And if a knife broke, they'd turn to bone, antler, or repurposed metal to shape a new one. And it wasn't just tools, they fixed everything. One diary tells of a woman who patched her son's shoes with bark and sinew, then wrapped his feet in canvas to keep out the snow. Another described replacing a wagon cover pole with a stripped pine sapling when theirs snapped in a storm. Even the thread was valuable. Women carried rolls of coarse linen or cotton thread, but when that ran low, they'd twist strands of sinew, or even hair, into makeshift sewing line. Needles were sharpened on stones. If those broke, bone or fish spines were sometimes used in their place. Nothing went to waste. An old horseshoe might become a hinge or a bracket. A broken tin cup could be flattened and reshaped into a patch for a lantern or a stove vent. Rope was spliced, twisted, woven from plant fibers or animal sinew. You didn't throw anything away, not because you were frugal, but because your life might depend on it later, and the tools themselves. Many were multifunctional. A tomahawk might chop wood in the morning, hammer pegs at noon, and defend the wagon at night. One solid blade was worth more than gold. Many settlers carried folding knives, belt axes, or even homemade chisels. And if they lost those, they sharpened rocks, split bones. Anything that could cut, carve, or hold weight became a tool. Here's something that puts it all into perspective. On the Oregon Trail, nearly every family had to stop and repair their wagon at least a dozen times. Wheels came off, brakes failed, tar leaked, rations spoiled, and still, they moved on. One diary from 1849 reads, "The tongue split clean through, and the wheel near gave way on the ridge." Father spent 5 hours with the draw knife while mother boiled soap. We leave at dawn if the glue holds. That glue was likely pine pitch mixed with ashes or animal fat, used as a kind of trail epoxy. Repairs didn't always last, but they bought you something more valuable. Another few miles, a little more time, a fighting chance. And out here, sometimes, that was enough. Out on the trail, thirst could kill faster than hunger. A person might survive weeks without food, but without water, you'd be lucky to last 3 days. But the real danger wasn't always finding water. It was drinking the wrong water. Streams looked clean. Crystal clear mountain pools shimmered in the sun. But inside, invisible killers, bacteria, parasites, disease, dysentery could gut an entire wagon party in a week. Cholera wiped out thousands. So pioneers had to do more than just find water. They had to purify it, without filters, without chemicals, without modern tools, and that meant boiling. If firewood was available and time allowed, they'd collect their water in iron pots or kettles and set it over the flames. The goal was a rolling boil, at least 5 minutes, longer if the source was especially muddy or stagnant. The heat killed most of the dangerous microbes. But what if the water was filled with sediment, bits of bark, mud, or animal waste? That's when the cloth came in. Women often carried muslin, linen, or even worn-out skirts, anything clean that could act as a filter. They'd stretch the fabric over a pot or cup and slowly pour the water through. It didn't make it pure, but it removed the worst of the debris. Some used layered cloth, folded again and again, to catch more particles. Others made cone filters with sand and charcoal when time and supplies allowed. And if boiling wasn't possible, they waited. Muddy water was poured into buckets and left to settle. After hours, the heavy sediment sank to the bottom, and the clearer water on top could be skimmed off. Still risky, but better than drinking straight from a hoofprint puddle. Sometimes desperate choices had to be made. Here's a grim line from an 1854 journal on the Snake River. "We've run out of wood and boiled nothing for 2 days. The boy vomits. Lizzie prays over him. I drink from the hoof pool and dare not tell her." That's how it was. No options. No safety net. Just judgment calls made under exhaustion, pressure, and fear. And yet, they adapted. Some pioneers learned from Native American tribes who used roots, sand, or even charcoal to clean water. Others relied on instinct. Fast-moving water over rocks was safer than a still pond. Springs high in the mountains were gold. A few even built crude cisterns, lining holes with bark or clay to collect rainwater. And on rare occasions, they'd boil water with heated stones dropped straight into wooden buckets when metal pots weren't available. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't clean by modern standards, but it kept people alive. And every drop, every cup of water that didn't make someone sick, was a quiet victory. One of the most underrated survival skills from the pioneer era was the ability to know where you were, without a map, a compass, or any kind of modern navigation. Out on the open plains or deep in the forest, direction could mean the difference between reaching your destination and getting hopelessly lost. Most pioneers didn't have a formal education in geography, but they had instincts, passed down wisdom, and keen observation skills. They learned to read the land like a book, using shadows, the sun's arc, the tilt of the land, even the way moss grew on trees. The most common trick was using the sun itself. Pioneers knew that in the northern hemisphere, the sun rises roughly in the east and sets in the west. But they took it further. Some would plant a stick in the ground and track its shadow every hour to figure out which direction they were facing. By marking the tip of the shadow at 2 points during the day, morning and afternoon, they could draw a line across the ground that ran east to west. From there, they'd know north and south. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough to avoid walking in circles. At midday, what they called solar noon, the sun would cast its shortest shadow. That was a reliable way to tell time. If your shadow was short and nearly straight below you, it was high noon. If it stretched long to the east, the day was waning. People learned to read the sky in this way, especially when traveling long stretches without visible landmarks. That's what made open plains so dangerous. No mountains to orient by, no trees to mark direction, just grass and sky. But even here, the movement of the sun gave direction. They also paid attention to trees. In northern climates, moss often grows thicker on the north-facing side of trees because it gets less sun. That rule isn't always dependable in dry or mixed terrain, but it worked well in the moist forests of the Midwest. Some frontiersmen would even note the direction trees leaned if they'd grown in persistent wind. Wind patterns often move from the west. The more time you spent outdoors, the more these small clues added up. At night, navigation didn't stop. If you were lucky and the skies were clear, you could use the stars. The North Star, Polaris, was the ultimate anchor. Native tribes and fur trappers taught pioneers how to locate it using the Big Dipper. The two outer stars of the Dipper's bowl point straight to it. If you could see the North Star, you could orient yourself, and by extension, know which way you were walking. Even without celestial markers, pioneers knew how to feel direction from the terrain. Rivers tend to carve valleys, which often point in the same general direction. Wildlife trails almost always lead to water. Birds flying in groups often head toward roosting areas or feeding grounds. These weren't guaranteed methods, but they were part of a larger survival mindset. Look for signs, pay attention, trust what the land is telling you. And then there was timekeeping. Without clocks or watches, many relied on the sun's movement or personal routines. Some set off each day when the dew burned off the grass. Others judged time by meal schedules or the behavior of animals, when the birds started their morning calls or when the coyotes began to howl. Others counted how many miles they could walk in an hour, then multiplied that over the day. It wasn't precise, but it got them through. Near Fort Boise, one traveler wrote, "We lost sight of the trail for near a day. The river curved and the sun disappeared behind mist. James said to follow the elk trail. We did, and found campfire smoke by dusk." That kind of intuition wasn't magic. It came from trial, error, and survival. It's easy to forget how recent the age of compasses and maps really is. In the 1840s and 50s, many wagons had no map at all, just advice from the last fort, stories from a trapper, or what they remembered from someone else's journal. A misplaced turn could add days to a journey or take you into dangerous country. Getting lost wasn't just inconvenient, it could be fatal. The Oregon Trail, for example, branched and rejoined in dozens of places. Those who missed a fork might end up in desert scrub instead of following a river. Others took so-called shortcuts that turned into disaster, like the infamous Meek Cutoff, which led families into deserts with no water and nearly killed entire trains. Navigation wasn't about following lines on a paper. It was about trusting your senses, watching the sky, listening to the land. And it wasn't just the men who learned this. Pioneer women, especially widows traveling alone, often became just as skilled. Children, too, some as young as 10, were tasked with tracking the sun or remembering which direction the wagon train came from. One woman crossing near the Dalles recalled, "We lost the scout and had no marker. My daughter stood on the wagon, pointed to the sun and said, 'We were walking into it this morning. Let's turn our backs to it now.' That saved us." It's a kind of wisdom we've nearly lost, overshadowed by GPS signals and satellite maps. But it's still there, waiting. And with just a little practice, you can learn to walk in their footsteps. When we talk about pioneer survival, we tend to focus on the skills: how to build a fire, how to clean water, how to navigate by the sun. But what's easy to forget is that these weren't just techniques. They were acts of desperation, perseverance, hope. Every small task, mending a boot, boiling a pot, sealing a wagon seam with pine tar, was one more way to keep death just a little farther away. These weren't rugged survivalists in some Hollywood version of the West. These were ordinary people, farmers, mothers, children, who were often scared, overwhelmed, and underprepared. But they adapted. They learned as they went. And in the process, they left behind a kind of unspoken wisdom that still matters. If you want to know what that really sounded like, you don't need to guess. You can read it, straight from their journals. Here's one from 1852, written by a 17-year-old girl named Elizabeth. Mother has taken ill again. The river water was too warm. We boiled what we could, but the firewood is scarce, and Pa's hands are blistered from the bow. I try not to cry in front of the children. They look at me now. There's no polish in those words, just raw truth. But in that truth is power. One young man near Independence wrote, "I thought I was ready. I had boots, a rifle, and dry powder, but the mud pulled my shoes off before the third creek, and my horse ran when the thunder came. I felt smaller than a child." We admire their toughness now, but to them, there was no other choice. They weren't being brave for the sake of being brave. They were just trying to get through it. And that's the part modern people often forget. The pioneers didn't have a backup plan. There were no helicopters, no texts for help. When something broke, you fixed it. When something ran out, you improvised. And when someone died, you buried them and kept walking. The trail was littered with those losses. At key spots like South Pass, Fort Bridger, or the banks of the Snake River, you'll still find grave markers carved in stone or wood, sometimes just initials, sometimes nothing at all. They didn't stop the journey for long. They couldn't. Still, among all that loss, there was endurance. That's what truly defines pioneer survival. Not just the techniques, but the mindset. They found ways to make do with what they had. They shared it with strangers. They taught each other. And they passed down knowledge, not in schools, but around campfires and over broken wagon wheels. Even today, much of what we call bushcraft or off-grid living is a direct descendant of what these families practiced by necessity. When you learn to start a fire with flint and steel, you're walking in the same rhythm they did. When you purify water with cloth and sun, when you use animal fat to make soap, when you stop at noon to read the sky for directions, you're not just learning skills, you're touching history. And what's remarkable is how relevant that history still is. We live in a time when everything is convenient. One click, 2-day shipping, GPS for the grocery store. But what happens when the lights go out? When the supply chain breaks? When you're alone in the woods? Or even just snowed in with no power for a few days? That's when these old skills, these forgotten survival skills, aren't quaint anymore. They're essential. Because the land hasn't changed. It's still wild. It still plays by its own rules. And if we lose the knowledge of how to live with it instead of against it, we lose something that kept our ancestors alive. There's a quiet dignity in knowing how to make your own fire, gather your own water, build your own light, and walk by the sun. And that's what this video is really about. Not just tools and tricks, but rediscovering the kind of self-reliance that built a nation. As we end, I want to share one more voice. It comes from a woman named Sarah, who crossed the Oregon Trail in 1846. Her journal was found decades later, and in it, she wrote, "We are weary, the wind bites, but still we go on. The mountains do not care for our suffering, and yet they do not stop us either. Each day is a kind of rebirth. I think we are becoming something new." Maybe that's the final truth of the pioneer spirit. It changes you. It humbles you. It teaches you to respect the land and yourself. So if you've watched this far, thank you. It means you carry a bit of that spirit too. And maybe, just maybe, the old ways aren't gone after all. They're just waiting to be remembered. Survival on the frontier was brutal, but for pioneer women, it was something else entirely. While the men got the credit, it was the women who cooked, mended, healed, endured, and survived, often with no help at all. In the next video, we're uncovering why it was so hard to be a pioneer woman and why they were the real heroes of the frontier. Click now to hear their side of the story.